So welcome to the first panel of the day, which is Music and Mystery, TV Conventions and Aesthetics. We have Leanne Weston with her paper, Were You Listening to That? Music, Memory and Meaning in Yellowjackets. Leanne Weston is an Institute of Advanced Study Early Career Fellow at the University of Warwick. She is published in Velvet Light Trap on televised music histories and is a contributor to forthcoming edited collections on Watership Down, the films of Jane Campion, and writing on film scoring.
Since its debut in November 2021, Yellowjackets has maintained a highly visible online presence. Discussion on the series is characterised by its attention to detail, with the analytical lens of fans and critics alike focused on searching for clues to understand its mysteries or reveal hidden meanings. Alongside recaps, spoiler discussion, and Reddit threads, Yellowjackets' soundtrack has become its own site of fascination, where music is both an intrinsic part of its acclaim and prestige. Music also occupies a significant, meaningful, and equally elevated position in the viewing experience of Yellowjackets and its inherent pleasures. The majority of the discussion has focused on the series' use of popular music and its music supervisors, Jen Malone and Whitney Pilzer, whose work provides the focus of this paper. Coverage of Yellowjackets' music, and in particular Malone and Pilzer's creative process, by Variety, Pitchfork, Billboard and others, is itself a combination of the increased critical attention afforded to music on television and the greater recognition for music supervision within the production process. Originating in writing on Alexandra Patsouras, this cultural shift has been consolidated by the formation of the Guild of Music Supervisors in 2010 and the introduction of a standalone Emmy category for Outstanding Music Supervision in 2017. The Yellowjackets soundtrack performs several functions that are different and yet complementary to the original score composed by Craig Redren and Anna Waronker, which I will now go on to explore. Operating on inter- and intratextual levels, music is both a site and an object of memory. It also transcends spatio-temporal boundaries, linking together the past and present of the series' split timeline. The value and meaning of the music used within Yellowjackets exceeds that of traditional scholarly understandings of popular music soundtracking, and becomes a textual element in its own right that expresses particular relationships with identity, social dynamics, and cultural memory. While it remains that music on television, as KJ Donnelly argues, serves to aestheticize and monumentalize the events played out on screen. Particular tracks are also placed to aid narrative clarity or bring depth to characterization, but music can also extend beyond these functions. As Jeff Smith, Ian Garwood and others have argued, song maintains an extrinsic ability to speak for characters and expand upon their emotional state. However, in Yellowjackets, music also speaks to and about its characters, giving them greater depth and complexity, drawing attention to what Garwood describes as the constructed relationship between character and song, extending beyond simple association with characters. This is most obvious in the attention given to the first relationship, that of music and identity. The emotional and narrative weight of this relationship is central to understanding who these characters are within the context of the story world they inhabit. For example, in the pilot episode, our introduction to the Shauna of 1996 is made through music. She listens to Liz Phair's Supernova in the car as she writes in her journal, waiting for her friend Jackie to arrive before driving them both to school. As the girl's journey progresses, a playful Jackie ejects the tape, replacing Phair with Snow's Informer playing on the radio, and she waits for Shauna's reaction. Their exchange continues as follows. Jackie: "Oh, were you listening to that?" Shauna: "No. It fell into the tape deck and I accidentally pressed play." In the script, Shauna's tape is identified as a mix, and both fair and snow are explicitly mentioned. The mix itself is described as angst adjacent, tying into an earlier description of Shauna as quietly discontent. These descriptors give us a sense of who Shauna is, reflected by the music that we hear. Simon Frith argues that music creates a unique relationship built on the intersection between taste and self-definition. This in turn helps us to answer questions concerning our identity. He writes, "We use pop songs to create for ourselves a particular sort of self-definition, a particular place in society. The pleasure that pop music produces is a pleasure of identification with the music we like, with the performers of that music, with the other people who like it." Malone and Pilzer included Shauna and Jackie's journey in their Season 1 music highlights, noting the ubiquity of both songs and the amusingly apt lyrical and musical contrast between them. Soundtracking these two songs to overlap in the same diegetic space offers an early insight into the girls' complex dynamic. There is equal pleasure in the different ways they choose to identify. Their personalities are wildly different, and yet they have an obvious shared history, built on their long-standing friendship that's conveyed through their interactions. This is clearly not the first time Jackie has done this, or indeed that Shauna has offered that response. Their difference from each other and affection for each other in spite of those differences is reiterated later in the episode, when Jackie teases Shauna for her seriously questionable taste in music. Shauna and Jackie's interactions establish a thread containing music taste and superiority that recurs with their teammate Natalie. She too is defined by her difference from her teammates, othered by her punk style and music taste. Her connection to them prior to the crash is mostly peripheral, left on the edge of the group. Instead, she remains closer to friends the other girls dismiss as stoners or burnout. For Natalie, music is a significant element of her identity, exemplifying Frith's comments on the complexities of self-definition and taste. As Pilzer observed, part of creating the soundtrack with Malone also involved thinking about music at the level of character, beyond the act of cultural curation that typically defines music supervision. Pilzer noted that this entailed thinking about their different personalities, placing themselves in the character's shoes to think about what they might actually be listening to. The presence of music in the characters' lives is not solely relegated to their listening habits, however. The attention to detail and authenticity which guided Malone and Pilzer's music choices also filters into other areas of production design and costuming. For instance, the girls' wider engagement in music culture is evident in Shauna and Natalie's room decor, featuring Kurt Cobain and Debbie Harry amongst others, emphasizing music's capacity for self-expression and individuation. This quality is maintained into adulthood, with band shirts still forming a staple part of Natalie's wardrobe. Across the series, she wears numerous t-shirts, including Pink Floyd and the Pixies as part of her outfit. Shauna, meanwhile, is later shown wearing a Yo La Tengo t-shirt, expressing her tastes more openly, while updating the style she had in her teens. Their connection to music and its surrounding culture is not something that fades or is discarded, but rather becomes part of their identity. Music, therefore, operates as a cultural shorthand to help us understand who these characters are throughout their lives, before, during, and after their time in the wilderness. Beyond the personal and individual music tastes of characters that sometimes find themselves at odds with each other, there are several moments in the series where a second kind of musical relationship is expressed. Here, music becomes what Thomas Curry describes as social glue, drawn from a larger ethnographic study on the structure and function of human music. Curry summarized that the main function of music is to bring people together and bond social groups. This remains true of the music used within Yellowjackets. where it's often positioned as a fundamental part of team bonding experiences, coinciding with the girls singing or dancing together in open displays of joyful unification, bringing them together outside the context of playing on the team. The first instance of this occurs in the pilot, with the girls in the locker room as they ready themselves for the pep rally. As Salt and Pepper's Shoop continues on the soundtrack, overlapping from the previous scene, the girls sing along to it unprompted, blurring the boundaries between diegetic and non-diegetic sound. Much like the Snow song we hear earlier in the episode, this is indicative of the song's popularity and thus ubiquity. Irrespective of their individual tastes, they're familiar enough with the lyrics to sing along. A similar second instance occurs in episode 5, Blood Hive. Following the conventions of a summer camp sleepover, the girls dance together in their new cabin home to Montel Jordan's This Is How We Do It, playing on a Walkman with its sound amplified by a metal bucket. As the song progresses, they announce different dance moves to each other, which they then attempt to copy. The cabin dance-off is offered up as a direct point of comparison with the pep rally sing-along. At this point in time, they're still the girls we met in the pilot, yet to fully acclimate to their new surroundings. Much like the Shoop sequence that precedes it, the cabin dance also causes a momentary break or rupture in the narrative, where we're allowed to revel in the joyous spectacle of them singing and dancing together. This is of course analogous to the framing of musical numbers, where characters break into song. While I don't wish to suggest that these moments in Yellowjackets perform the same function as in a musical, as the girls singing and dancing is spontaneous, rather than staged and well rehearsed, but they do precipitate a similar moment of emotional expression and cultural exchange, one that allows the girls freedom and happiness during increasingly more stressful moments. However, the girls' joy is fleeting, with the dance interrupted when the Walkman batteries die out. Music, their tether to the civilized world and their old lives, suddenly and unceremoniously snaps, breaking the illusion that everything's fine. Later in the episode, Jackie tests different batteries without success, while the girls busy themselves with tasks around the camp, more easily adjusting to their life in the wilderness. This time, music, or the lack of it, is a signifier of Jackie's increasing isolation from the rest of the group, as she struggles to adapt to their predicament, losing grasp on all that's familiar. In what remains of this paper, I'd like to focus on one final relationship expressed through the music in Yellowjackets, one that examines music and memory, and music as memory in more detail. Later coverage of Yellowjackets' soundtrack is defined by its specific attention to music as a site of memory, and/or as a memory object. Carrie Whitmer's article for Harper's Bazaar is one such example. In it, Whitmer engages directly with the transformative nature of music and its potential to be a nostalgic trigger. For Whitmer, hearing the music again allows her to revisit moments from her childhood she didn't even realize she'd remembered. Acting as a conduit to re-engage with her own past, Whitmer's sentiments are also shared by Malone, who describes the collaborative process of creating the soundtrack as taking a lot of walks down memory lane. Such reflections are by no means isolated, with numerous writers engaging with the series soundtrack from the perspective of memory, compelled to offer personal reflections prompted by hearing the music again as an adult. The opening of Leah Carroll's article from Vulture offers a vivid example of this tendency. She writes, "Teenage girls collude through song. Music is a secret code, a signal, a warning." Here, Carroll not only points toward the centrality of music to Yellowjackets, but makes explicit the connections between music and memory, describing the series as splattering her adolescent memories all over the screen. Carroll's evocative reflection is a fittingly gory one, and like the comments of Whitmer and Malone, attributes the music with a cultural weight and emotive value, one that recognises the effective potential of the soundtrack, recalling Catherine Kalinak's observations on the dual function of music. She argues that music operates as a mediator between the screen and the spectator, whereby it becomes both an articulator of screen expressions and an initiator of screen response. In his discussion of music's evolution in television drama, Charles Fairchild argues similarly regarding music's affective capacities. He suggests that placing songs at a highly charged, dramatic and emotional moments often has the effect of fusing the music and the action. The interaction between these elements allows each to become an effective and affective partner with the other. There's one sequence within Yellowjackets that eloquently illustrates both elements of Fairchild's argument, demonstrating that memory work also occurs within the series itself. The use of Seal's Kiss from a Rose in episode 9, Doomcoming, represents the intersection of effect and affect that Fairchild describes. Taking place during the girls' quasi-homecoming dance, retitled Doomcoming to reflect their increasing nihilism and vanishing hopes of rescue, the girls dress up and dance together in couples, just as they would have at school. No longer able to access the music they would usually listen to, they sing the Seal song themselves instead. As the scene continues, their singing is replaced on the soundtrack by the recorded version. The sequence represents a narrative peak, crystallizing the point where music, memory, and meaning coalesce, signifying a final goodbye to their lives before the crash. Like the earlier sequences in the locker room and the cabin, this sequence also blurs the boundaries between diegetic and non-diegetic sound. This time, the girls' knowledge of the lyrics are derived entirely from their memory, a memory of another time and place, one that seems increasingly distant. The sequence epitomizes Tia Denora's assertion that music indexes memory, operating as a container for the temporal structure of past circumstances. For instance, we hear Kiss from a Rose again in the series finale, when an adult Jeff and Shauna dance at their high school reunion. Here, a triple moment of effective encoding occurs, where we engage with what Kalinak calls the collective resonance of musical associations. To conclude, I'd like to offer some further thoughts on what such resonances and associations mean within the context of music and meaning in the Yellowjackets soundtrack. As I touched upon earlier, when we listen to Kiss from a Rose, we recall several listening contexts that can overlap whilst remaining temporally distinct. Our original context, the song's use in Doomcoming, and its reuse during the dance in Sick Transit Gloria Mundi. According to Denora, music reheard and recalled provides a device for unfolding, for replaying the temporal structure of that moment, its dynamism as an emerging experience. This is why, for so many people, the past comes alive to its soundtrack. The aliveness Denora speaks of resonates throughout the soundtrack of Yellowjackets in its reception. Just as Malone and Pfizer walked down memory lane to create the sounds that allowed Carol and Whitmer to re-engage with their adolescent memories, we too engage in a process of rediscovery and re-engagement. Throughout this paper, I have argued that attending to the meaning behind the function of a soundtrack also allows us to recognise their potential beyond understandings of them as time machines or jukeboxes. In her own reflection on Kiss from a Rose and the emotional response it generated, Malone stated, "We want you to connect to that scene on that level because that song means to you what that song meant to the girls." The success of Yellowjackets and attention afforded to its soundtrack illustrates the depth of that connection and the underlying emotional resonance that Malone and Pilzer strive to create. Through their work, Yellowjackets' soundtrack becomes a rich, meaningful, and meta-reflexive site of cultural exchange, which stimulates and reshapes our listening habits, whether driven by memories of personal experience or excitement of new musical discoveries. should we have the capacity to listen as well as hear, the soundtrack becomes so much more than just a jukebox or a time machine. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully everyone has had enough time to watch that amazing presentation from Leanne. I still can't believe the audacity of Jackie to eject Liz Fair in favor of Informer by Snow. It does say a lot about her character. All right, so next up we have Alexander Beare. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly? Alexander and Amy.
It's Beare, but people make that mistake all the time, so it's okay.
Alexander Beare. Okay. So yeah, we have Alexander and Amy doing a joint presentation. So I don't know if you want to start sharing your screen and getting everything ready, and I'll just introduce you both. So Alexander is a PhD candidate at the University of Adelaide. His thesis is entitled Retrospectively Reading The Sopranos. I'm just doing a rewatch at the moment. It explores how old television texts are being adapted to new cultural and televisual environments by active audiences. His research interests are television studies, audience studies, complex TV, media memory, and masculinity studies. And presenting with him is Amy, who is a PhD candidate from the University of Adelaide as well. Her thesis, The Evolution of Interactive Romance in AAA RPGs, looks at the patterns, trends, and shifts the most popular role-playing games have gone through in exploring digital love. Her research interests include game studies, emergent narrative, media studies, and fan studies. And she's also an avid fan of Yellowjackets, which you're in the right place. All right, so let me just get my timer, and yep, take it away whenever you're ready.
All right, so thanks, Leanne. That was a really interesting presentation. Some fascinating stuff there. So today, yeah, we'd like to talk about Yellowjackets and basically how it deals with mystery and storytelling. And we're going to take a twofold approach to this. So I'm going to talk about it from I'm going to talk about it from kind of a textual perspective. So how is the show, engaging with these ideas of, I suppose, like the mystery box storytelling and this idea of like a drillable text. And Amy's going to take it from the perspective of, I suppose, fan studies, right? So actually looking at how communities online are engaging with these different approaches to mystery that Yellowjackets has, okay? So I want to start off by talking about this idea of the mystery box, right? So it's this term that we've all heard thrown around a bunch. It's not a super formal kind of academic theory or anything like that. It's actually most associated with J.J. Abrams, and I think a TED talk he did in like 2007 or something. But basically, for the purpose of this paper, I want to talk about it as basically this idea, the storytelling technique, where in a TV show or something like that, a central mystery is introduced, at the beginning, where kind of everything's revolving around that mystery, and there's lots of threads and clues that the audiences need to pick up to kind of figure out, what the mystery is, kind of what's in the mystery box, right? So kind of when we think about mystery box shows, we think about stuff like Lost, Game of Thrones, Westworld, stuff like that. And usually mystery box stuff can be characterized with the audience asking the question, what's up with X? What's up with that, right? So these mysteries keep audiences guessing, and they encourage them to follow these kind of breadcrumb trails and keep their eyes kind of peeled for the tiniest piece of evidence that might be critical to uncovering some big grand conspiracy, right? Essentially figuring out, as I was saying, and what people on the chat are saying, what's in the box, right? And so for Jason Mattel, these types of shows, he describes them as drillable, right? They encourage this mode of forensic fandom that invites viewers to dig deeper, probe beneath the surface to understand the complexity of the story and how it's told. Mattel cites the example of Lost and its kind of sprawling wiki page, Lostopedia, and talks about how fans would come together, decode episodes, look for all these little breadcrumbs, all these Easter eggs, and try and kind of figure out what's going to happen, drawing from transmedia extensions. I think there was like a lost video game between season 1 and 2 or something like that. Basically, trying to figure out what the kind of resolution to the mystery is going to be. Obviously, TV shows kind of lean into this. It's really great to get that kind of fan engagement. And it's become really common in a lot of, sci-fi, horror, kind of television programming over like the last, I suppose, like 10 to 15 years, right? So, of course, Yellowjackets certainly engages with this type of storytelling. It quickly sets up a lot of kind of core questions, right? So how did the Yellowjackets get into that state we see them in the first scene, right? Where they're kind of, it's implied they're about to eat someone, right? Who is Adam? What's his identity? What happens to Jackie? Who is it that's blackmailing Shauna, Misty, Ty, and Nat, right? And so, yeah, the show is really aware of it, and it actually uses the same kind of vague imagery to bait audiences into thinking there's some grand conspiracy or massive twist coming right around the corner. So if we look at, the blackmailing of Shauna, Ty, Nat, and Misty, we might think, who's doing this? Is it someone who was, secretly there in the wilderness? How do they know? Well, it turns out, at least in season 1, it was just Jeff. Additionally, when we think about Jackie's death, right, there's this kind of hinting that, maybe she was murdered, maybe something really sinister happened, we're going to find out. But in the end, it turns out that it's kind of the culmination of a rift between her and Shauna that goes throughout the first season, right? Thematically, it's really neat. Jackie kind of represents the old world. She can't adapt to the new world. She's hung up on this kind of betrayal. As was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, the cultural capital, can't really be spent. And it's kind of the disconnect there, and her kind of eventual demise, thematically lines up really well. Additionally, and this brings me to, I suppose, Adam, right? And this is the kind of thing that I think is really interesting. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding his identity. Is he connected to a vast conspiracy? Is he strategically trying to get information from Shauna? What does his ambiguous back tattoo mean? Well, it turns out he was basically, at least in season 1, just some guy, right? And one of the big reveals when he's eventually killed is that he was just some guy. Despite this, Shauna was convinced that he had all these sinister motives, and she crafted vast theories about who he was. And I think that's really interesting. So one of the writers of the show, Bart Nickerson, writes that the paranoia and those kinds of theories were the intent of the way we had this story unfold, right? The hope was to make the audience somewhat complicit in his murder, because paranoia is one of the outgrowths of Shauna's trauma. And the way she sees the world right now was the subjective experience that we were after, right? I think that's really interesting and quite significant, because it actually shows somewhat of a payoff of this kind of mystery box baiting, right? It allows us to identify a lot more with Shauna, kind of makes the audience somewhat complicit in Adam's murder. And it's leveraging these fan activities of drilling, looking for all these breadcrumbs, looking for all these clues, in this really interesting kind of payoff in which, Shauna's emotional state is brought to the fore, and our increased identification or, empathy of her position is actually what's important here. It seems like that is kind of more important than kind of figuring out, what's in the box, who is Adam, right? Which I think is a really interesting way to kind of leverage these kinds of fan activities that have become pretty commonplace over the last 10 to 15 years. So I'm going to hand over to Amy now, who's going to talk about the effects that this kind of storytelling has had on the fan community.
Thanks for that, Alex. Hopefully you can hear me. Sorry. Yes, so as Alex talked about really well there, the fact that this show has these conventions of other drillable shows, the fact that it is so drillable, and shows like Lost and Game of Thrones, it has really impacted the way that fans engage with each other and sort of with the show itself. So audiences have been really conditioned, at least in this genre, again, for the last 10 to 15 years, to watch sort of mystery box shows and expect that there's always some sort of grand conspiracy, always a twist, trust no one's motivations, hidden ideas. And there's such an emphasis on the twist, again, as Alex has sort of touched on, that here we sort of see the sort of focus on the show, or these kinds of shows can sometimes be about the puzzle or the answer and the point. And it's, again, interesting thinking about how Lost and other sort of shows like Game of Thrones, these drillable shows that have sort of had, shall we say, disappointing mixed responses to the endings, sort of with some fans feeling sort of unsatisfied with sort of unsatisfactory climaxes or conclusions to narratives. It's really interesting to sort of look at how that's impacted the Yellowjackets audience, particularly where we are drawing from the Yellowjackets subreddit, so the forum. It's really interesting some of the responses you see sort of around this about this genre. So here we've got someone who's talking about the sort of the threads that happen sometimes with these sort of shows that sort of go by the wayside. And they talk about that, not every story has to be sort of neatly wrapped in a nice little package, but the idea that threads or stories are not being addressed or worse rushed is essentially terrible. Again, they point out Lost and Game of Thrones. Here they talk about, hopefully you can see, I don't know how much this is blocking, but here someone talks about hoping this show doesn't turn into Lost. They couldn't stand how unrealistic that show became. Again, hoping that Yellowjackets doesn't leave people with unanswered questions and unsatisfying conclusions. Again, like Lost did, it's taken a lot of hits here. And again, where we take our title of this presentation from, people again saying we don't want a Lost 2.0. Here someone's talking about the idea that Lost really, Yellowjackets really reminds them of watching Lost, and they really enjoy that drillable element, but they're also slightly sort of worried and a bit nervous at how this the sort of similarities of the feelings of the show sort of brought. And again, as they say, if there's anything they've learned from Lost and Game of Thrones, the fan theories are almost always better than how the real things end up. So there's a genuine, palpable fear of what this show could turn into, or how these threads might sort of, how things might go, basically. And again, finally, we've got this idea of Lost traumatizing this person. Again, very strong emotive language here. But this is not uncommon throughout the subreddit. Again, they will say that these other shows sort of tortured them, strung them along. Again, traumatized comes up a lot. And it's again, important to sort of think about and talk about how they're engaging with this here. And it's, again, they say, that sort of Lost has made them skeptical of starting new shows. They need the show to finish. They need to know what people think before they start a new show. And if they say if Yellowjackets burns them, they're basically not going to start a new series again. So again, it's interesting to focus on this, and it's interesting to focus on this idea of again, emotive language, like being traumatized by these shows. Again, this person sort of doesn't is worried about the idea of Yellowjackets engaging with sort of Lost syndrome. So the idea of all these red herrings, of all these loose threads, and then essentially they sort of chalk it up to the supernatural elements of the show, and how potentially, or it seems that the supernatural elements will cause the show to sort of lose that sort of narrative consistency. And that's something we really noticed looking through the subreddit as well, that there was sort of two camps that had formed, two sort of teams around discussion of the show, those who advocate for more supernatural elements in the show, and who sort of are against more supernatural elements in the show. And here's just some sort of examples of some of the things they talked about. So we've got this idea of, some people really want that, the supernatural element, they want to engage with it more, the sort of folklore elements. Someone's even cited the idea that the team that is sort of the group that are against supernatural elements are sort of the psychological only team. So there's a recognition sort of within the subreddit that this is happening, that there's this tension here. And again, people being shocked that people don't want more supernatural elements, considering obviously there is quite an engagement with folklore supernatural elements within the show. And then we turn to sort of the more against the supernatural elements of the show. People, there's a real palpable fear of sort of what that can kind of what route that might take. Again, and there's just a sort of idea that things that will engage in sort of supernatural narratives may get sort of lost or not be sort of narratively satisfactory. And yeah, there's just a real tension here. And it's worth thinking about sort of why there is this tension. Someone has sort of within the subreddit has commented and talked about why people are so sort of, or fans are sort of fearful or hesitant with this supernatural element of the show. And they mentioned how it's probably a holdover resentment from Lost and similar shows, again, these mystery box shows that are thrillable. And they talk about how the sort of length of these shows really impacts what kind of impacts how people sort of engage in these areas, and how the supernatural elements sort of can kind of go a bit funky. But they also sort of talk about how the supernatural elements can sort of make a kind of hand wave answer to a lot of more complex narrative ideas, essentially. And what's really interesting as well when it comes to sort of how fans are engaging with these theories, and someone mentioned the citizen detective sort of taking it on themselves to really look at the show in all these different ways, is how engaged the creators, people engaged in who are creators of Yellowjackets in any way, have kind of really been vocal about debunking and confirming different theories and parts of the show. So you have, they confirmed that yes, Jackie has, passed away, that this was not, she's not a time traveler or anything like that. And, they've confirmed that Adam is not Jarvie, things like that. And some of that you understand from a sort of narrative and sort of consistency, thematic perspective, why they would potentially essentially want these storylines to be sort of confirmed from a narrative perspective. But then they go on to sort of even talk more. They talk about how the symbol has no set meaning yet, which is such an important part of the show. They've mentioned that the cult members have no new survivors, essentially. Sorry, have no survivors in the ones that took Nat. And they've also confirmed that we're going to see an adult Lottie, which again, it wasn't that it necessarily wasn't confirmed within the text, but it definitely was left more vague than they have subsequently talked about it afterwards. So it's interesting, again, thinking about the sort of potentially the overcorrection here as a way to sort of distance themselves, the creators, from shows like Lost and these mystery box, these drillable shows, as a way to sort of distance themselves. They're really trying to be vocal and not letting fans, it seems, go too intense and sort of all over the place with theories. But it's interesting because, again, fans are not particularly happy always with the creators talking too much. So here's some of the responses to, again, the creators' different debunkings and confirmations. So you've got people saying this ruins the mystery of the show, not liking that they're telling us different things, wishing that they would focus on showing more and less telling. And again, and someone even speculates that it's as though they don't want fans speculating and coming up with theories. So it's interesting to sort of think about here how it appears that the creators are trying to sort of have viewers unlearn these textual codes of television they've come to be used to in this genre, and that there's this palpable fear from fans that Yellowjackets will be narratively unsatisfactory, as they have found these previous shows to be, and in attempting to sort of re-educate viewers on what they expect what they should expect from the show, there is sort of the potential that they're, again, impacting the sort of pleasures from the experiences of discovery and mystery that the show is trying to cultivate there. But I'll throw it back to Alex in conclusion.
So yeah, just to wrap things up, I guess. So yeah, overall, from both a textual and I suppose a fan studies perspective, right? Yellowjackets has kind of been encouraging, I suppose, a different type of drilling, right? So there's not so much this emphasis on, you know, predicting these dissonant plot twists to solve, you know, mystery boxes. Rather, it's basically teaching us to look for horses instead of zebras, which I think is something really interesting when we consider the broader kind of televisual landscape with these kinds of shows. And especially, it's really interesting when we look at the fan communities and we see, you know, this process of, you know, I suppose, unlearning these textual codes, I guess, as Amy put it, is really interesting as it brings out a lot of tensions and it kind of draws out the different pleasures associated with these different types of, I suppose, you know, mystery box storytelling, right? But yeah, overall, I think, yeah, it brings out, or ultimately can help bring out a lot of the themes of the show, right? So it can really, if the emphasis is taken away from, you know, what's in the box, maybe there's more of an emphasis on, you know, the show's themes of, you know, friendship, grief, and trauma. Yeah, thank you very much.
But yeah, thank you for that. We'll go straight into our final paper of the panel. Dr. James Rendall, if you want to make yourself, oh, there you are, and you can get your screen sharing going. James is a lecturer in creative industries at the University of South Wales. He's researching horror media and its audiences. He has published in New Review of Film and Television Studies, Transformative Works and Cultures, Participations and Global TV Horror. And his forthcoming monograph is Transmedia Terrors in Post-TV Horror, which sounds amazing. So whenever you're ready.
Cool, thank you. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Yep, cool. Okay, so situated within the current cycle of US quality television drama, the Amy Boyle note centers on female trauma and what Stacey Abbott terms the new golden age of TV horror. Yellowjackets' tale of a female high school team fighting for survival in the Canadian wilderness, their descent into cannibalism, and their subsequent adult life has received ample praise for its use of music. Building on this, I want to analyze the series' soundscape with a particular focus on the female choral voice as gendered subversion, where collective acts of speech, song, or screams foster homophonic homosociality, try saying that when you're pissed, between these young women and polyphonic female empowerment, particularly in spaces traditionally defined as masculine, so punk scenes, natural wilderness, and football or soccer as a team sport. Moreover, I argue that the survivors' lives back in civilization mutes the power of such primal collective expression, emblematic of neoliberal society that mirrors the real-world patriarchal silencing of women. Indeed, Marsha Houston and Cheris Cramare explain women's silence in many places is so accepted that many do not even notice it, while Mark Stuffit notes this reflects a society that desires sedate kinds of female behaviour in public, end quote. Concurrently, both pop music and its female fan base has been disdained for being over-emotional, too vocal in their love for popular culture, deemed trivial and of low cultural value. Yet there is subversive potential in the female fan, and I think this is something that the show kind of revels in. Providing the wonderful term, the screamscape, Nicolette Raw argues the adoration of young female fans of the Beatles expressed for the band had feminist potential. For Raw, fan screams constituted a rebellion against the gendered norms of public behaviour, governing the era as well as a precursor to the also gendered social, cultural, sexual and political rebellions of the 1960s, end quote. Addressing that, young girls were kicking and screaming, twisting and shouting when they were supposed to be ladylike, a notion underscored by heightened prescriptions for femininity in the post-war era, end quote. Duffett reaffirms this within a present-day context, stating screaming offers a powerful sense of enfranchisement. Female fans who scream own not just their heroes, but their collective right in emotionally expressing that sense of ownership. Screaming disrupts both corporally and sonically the environment where the act takes place, and embodied by those undertaking the act. As Schwenger writes, we wish to escape from the body, from its localization, its space and time, and so we scream, where the scream is a projection of the self out of the body, an alternative acoustic body, end quote. As such, screaming and sort of loud vocal noises, therefore, are transformative, unruly, performative acts. Exploring unruliness, Christopher Holliday argues that alongside many other grotesque and unsettling violations of traditional neoconservative gender ideologies, the unruly woman remakes femininity by inverting and diverting feminist cultural logic, end quote. The unruly female body, a common depiction within the horror genre, therefore, according to Holliday, is rooted in a framing discourse of non-conformity, as it provides a challenge to normative female behavior, decorum, and beauty through efforts of power and deviancy, end quote. So this female sort of tumultuous voice amplified in unison then can be seen as an unruly performative act in the face of conservative restricted hegemony that positions traditional femininity as quiet or mute. And we see this played out in various ways throughout the first season of Yellowjackets. So this is evident in the Yellowjackets opening titles, which as a paratextual device, Abbott's notes evokes the narrative and thematic landscape of the series, works to establish generic signifiers, and guides audiences to engage with the text in particular ways. The title track, No Return, composed and produced by Anna Waronker and Craig Wedren, is a blend of haunting Gothic sound via its use of organ, arpeggio riff, grunge bass line with its sort of syncopation, putting emphasis on the offbeat, making for an unsettling undertone, and riot girl punk power. And importantly, Rosenberg and Gruffalo explained the name Riot Girl was chosen to reclaim the vitality and power of youth with an added growl to replace the perceived passivity of girl, end quote, evoking female unruliness previously discussed. As Kristen Schultz highlights, Riot Girl was born out of a punk ethos of DIY, combined with feminist politics that developed from the increasing dissatisfaction with punk gender dynamics felt by many women involved in the DC and Olympia punk scenes in the late 1980s, galvanizing a sonic battle cry for girls across the country to move outside the bedroom culture, to quote Frith. Moreover, the title track, through its use of sound and image, mimics music videos from the 1990s, I would argue. This provides a temporal anchoring of the show and its setting, but it also harnesses music videos' dreamlike or nightmarish audiovisual sensibility, offering what Goodwin terms synesthesia, the intrapersonal process whereby sensory impressions are carried over from one sense to another, where video clips build on the soundtrack's visual associations. Interspersed between the horror iconography, the moody and abrasive Riot Girl tonality is mirrored in the visuals where we see the girls together, smoking, Jackie using her finger to sort of mimic cutting a throat before winking at the camera. We see them partying, giving the middle finger, drinking alcohol, and as a result, vomiting. All unruly rebel girl behavior that subverts gender roles, melded with the sonic pushback of Riot Girl in synesthetic fashion. Furthermore, Awonka's reverbed voice is frequently doubled on the track or supported with backing vocals. Whilst this haunting doubling could foreshadow the splitting of identity between hidden past and present, or the sort of women's mental splitting as they turn animalistic in the woods, I would argue the co-presence of Awonka's voice is itself choral, evoking a female collective reflective of the Riot Girl scene, where the phrase "same as you" connotes allyship. Likewise, the aggressively sung "no return, no reason" reflects a rejection of the past and cultural tradition and the oppressive norms of rational society. In fact, the collective female voice that gives the title track part of its haunting tone is also pertinent to the pilot episode's opening sequence, later developed in the series as we see the woman become ever more monstrous as a leitmotif. Halfyard explains that leitmotifs are musical themes that often incorporate a particular rhythmic figure, texture, or instrumentation, end quote. Resultantly common within TV productions, leitmotifs serve as auditory interpretive function, often when we hear them repeated and revised as musical blocks over the duration of the series. So the scene opens with an unidentified girl running through the snow-washed wild, engravings on the trees resembling eyes, as we hear whispers. As the girls flee an unseen threat, it cuts to stick and bone totems hanging from the trees. The whispers turn to human projected animal noises and screams. It's the cacophony of female voice that we hear but cannot see, where they're being projected from, the index, the monstrous feminine, both proximate but unlocatable. The screams surround the victim. A similar soundscape is evident in Robert Eggers' The Witch. Sage Walton writes that sonic dissonance seems to emanate from all directions, creating the impressions that the air itself is screaming, end quote, where the score houses invisible presence that reside in nature, end quote, whereby the witch moves seamlessly between the non-diegetic and diegetic. In thinking about this markedly female voice, Naomi Blacklot explains that the female scream is associated with historical representations of hysteria, alongside constructions of feminine creatures such as witches, sirens, and banshees. Further, Wells argues that there is an attraction of the witch's speech to the radical unruliness of all creative women that fosters orally induced transformative power. In both The Witch and Yellowjackets, the female monstrous chorus is what Michael Shion terms acousmet, an acousmatic being, heard but not seen. These characters often have striking powers or gifts because of their acousmatic existence. They see all, know, are omnipotent and ubiquitous, to quote Stilwell. As she flees, the victim falls into a pit of spikes, and with her body quietly twitching, we hear something between a moan or horn, a wolf cry, and accompanied by other animal noises as one of the group looks down on the corpse. Later in the episode, we hear the leitmotif again, and the body is dragged, hung, and bled by the group. As the throat is slit, the female voices gain prominence alongside tribal percussion, and echoed again at the end of the episode as we see the group partake in cannibalism. And we get this wonderful shot where the camera sort of flies over them in witch-like fashion to show the expansive spectacle of landscape. The leitmotif repeats in the Doom's Coming episode as Misty's magic mushrooms cause everyone to trip. The group's sensory understanding of the world around them allows them to feel something is coming. This is accompanied by a similar score of tribal percussion and wailing that not only groups those who have ingested the cocktail, but further serves to silo Jackie from the pack as the music fades as she takes Travis into the cabin to lose her virginity. When the group, led by Lottie, decide that Travis doesn't belong to her, they set out to get Jackie, and the score elevates with drums and choral shouting. Both sonic aspects grow, mirroring the carnal empowerment of the group as they move through the forest. Hearing the wolves who had previously attacked them, nearly killing and disfiguring Van, the women scream back in animalistic fashion. This metamorphic act turns them into predators themselves as they become the previously unseen acousmet. The nascent acousmatic realized they set upon Travis both sexually and carnivorously, perceiving him as a deer or stag, an animal they had previously shot and ate. With this, the soundtrack reintroduces the title sequence three-note organ riff heard and the bass line layered on top of that witch tribalistic chant. Thus, compared to the trope of the middle-class suburban men returning to and conquering nature to reinstall traditional modes of masculinity, so think of something like Deliverance, for example. In Yellowjacket, these young women become part of the wilderness that welcomes the subversive screamscape. Now, returning to the first episode, after a series of interviews from the town's citizens who knew the girls, we see them as a team win the soccer game that will send them to the national finals. Menison and Clement explain that the gender definition of sports emphasizes viral heterosexual masculinity, which by the very fact requires gender conformity for women in general and for female athletes in particular. In this respect, the most appreciated sports are those in favor or do not prohibit the expression of feminine gracefulness during performance in spite of intensive training. This is most often true of individual sports such as track, long jump, and of course, sports designed to be aesthetic. So gymnastics, modern dance, synchronized swimming, etc. End quote. And this is mirrored in the town, who give scant attention to the female Yellowjackets, but lavish praise on the failing male high school baseball team. As such, Menison and Clement note women playing soccer transgress the dominant representation of athletic women, widely publicized and systematically reinforced by the media, end quote. Thus, the team undermined gender codings as a team, but also through their use of voice. And again, this is synesthetically rendered in the scene where we hear the continuation of the ethereal collective female, accompanied by drums beating in battle-like fashion as they're playing the game that will send them to the final. This score reflects the group's strength as the team and their ability to vocalize emotion, a sort of safe space for where they can be loud as a group. Exemplified when after winning the game, they scream in joyous rapture, before shouting the team's buzz chant. Yet the team is far from a gendered utopia. Instead, in line with more recent female-centered dramas, Yellowjackets offers an imperfect, flawed representation of femininity that challenges the post-feminist discourse of having or being at all. To ensure they won't impede the team, Ty suggests they don't pass to Ali during the final. Yet in training, Ty's tough love approach indicates the monstrous potential of these young women. Significantly, as the practice starts, the leitmotif of the witch screamscape swells, foreshadowing imminent horror. As the choral crescendo reaches its frenzy, Ty's tackle brutally breaks Ali's leg as bone rips through skin. Here, the non-diegetic sound reflects the inner innate monstrous potential and power of women that exist in them even before they crash into the wilderness. So alongside discordant monstrous vocality, we also see the team frequently sing pop songs together. Yet much like the fluidity of witch orality, the singing combines diegetic voice with non-diegetic soundtrack. Roland Barthes posits there are two musics, the music one listens to and the music one plays. These two musics are totally different arts, each with its own history, its own sociology, its own aesthetics, its own erotic. The same composer can be a minor if you listen to him, tremendous if you play him even badly. The latter Barthes notes is making sound makes meaning, whereby the body as inscriber and not just transmitter or simple receiver, end quote. So we hear the girls sing Salt and Pepper's Shroop in the changing rooms. Importantly, as the music fades, it is the collective voice reciting the lyrics that rings out. In essence, the group's a cappella voice brings the music into being, which is then supported by non-diegetic sound, most starkly rendered during the Dooms Come party, where they start singing Seal's Kiss from a Rose to one another before the original track is brought in non-diegetically. In both instances, onus is not on singing quality, rather meaning comes from reciting lyrics together and to one another that bonds the characters. So this is particularly notable when the team sing and dance to Montel's This Is How We Do It, choreographing moves in their pajamas. The cabin, I would argue, substitutes for a teen bedroom, a site that Melanie Lowe explains is a domestic private safe space for young women to explore identity, sociality, and sexuality. A space we might also note that is violently invaded by Natalie's father back in society. As noted, pop music and its young female audience are frequently denigrated. However, Lowe argues that tweens, aged between 8 and 12, smile and laugh when they hear their favorite pop songs, dance and sing along nonetheless. At these moments, the social practice of being teen pop's target audiences involves not reading or consuming a text individually, but experiencing it together. The girls could be singing nonsense and still perform this communal activity. Together, in peer groups, they often choose to hear but not listen, to see but not read, a strategy that allows them to maintain strong, often feminist convictions and still enjoy consuming music that does not jibe with maturing politics, end quote. While the Yellowjackets are older than the tween demographic, such freedom of expression and discovery of identity that Lowe describes is present in a young woman's engagement and creation of song and sound. Thus, in the face of patronizing dismissal, the cabin as safe bedroom revels in female collective song and dance, even if the music is designed for commercial profit. Moreover, rather than compartmentalizing the women into respective antagonistic musical scenes or cult mainstream dichotomies, the soundtrack allows the women to embody the ethereal siren song of the witch, the aggressive punch of Riot Girl, and the freedom of enjoyment to popular chart music in a far more inclusive manner, which itself, I would argue, is kind of unruly with feminist potential. So by way of a conclusion, if the female choral supports identity and sociology within spaces that stress both subversive and collective voice, the present-day society the survivors find themselves in actively works against this communal feminist vocality. Whilst the choice of the track may be used to frame the scene as comedic and further signify the character's punk counter-hegemony, or as Lindsay noted, the kind of criminal acts, the use of the Offspring's track Come Out and Play as the entrance song for when Shauna, Ty, and Nat joined the high school reunion notes, you've got to keep them separated. I would argue this is a sort of a nod to or supporting of the neoliberal ideologies that disband and disempower women. As we see this in various ways, Shauna finds herself trapped and confined as a housewife who reflects, ironically, in the safety of her teen daughter's bedroom. To Ty, this is not how she foresaw her life trajectory. As she does, we see a poster inform us to keep calm and marry Harry, a reference to the pop star Harry Styles, I think, a direction to stay sedate if one is to fulfill hegemonic heteronormative yearnings. In comparison, Ty is both politically attacked by her rival candidate and seemingly cannot be a career woman and a parent, let alone Black and queer in these spheres of life. Despite a tough exterior, Nat's vulnerability stems from an abusive father that results in her entrapment within a system that does not readily support and actively punishes her. So the subduing and disenfranchising of these female characters in various arenas reflects the real world silencing of women, whether that be in political sphere, particularly supported by Trump's repeated interrupting of Hillary Clinton and stalking her on stage during the 2016 presidential debates, something the former would do throughout his time in office, or online where women disproportionately receive more sexually aggressive commentary and severe harassing threats compared to men for daring to have a voice. And here, a particular onus is placed on group-based hate speech that centers on vitriol specifically aimed at identity markers, such as being a woman, when targeting individuals. In a number of patriarchal institutions, such as media and Hollywood, the armed forces, and academia, similar toxic actions have resulted in the systemic violence of women. For them to then be muzzled with legal threats, blacklisting that makes them persona non grata and effectively unemployable, are paid off, being blamed for their actions or bodies themselves, or such events being brushed under the rug so as to maintain the veneer of institutional respectability and to maintain gendered powers. As Nadeem and Fladmore underscore, gender-based hate and sexual harassment are intended to restore both women and men to their place and reinforce the difference between the genders. And this again is about keeping women quiet. This has also resulted in collective activism, such as the Me Too and Time's Up movement, yet these two are now seeing pushback for being ostensibly too loud. And more recently, the binding control of women, their bodies, and their choice pertaining to reproduction, and the criminalization of abortion with the potential for the US Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. Moreover, given that the Yellowjackets were off to the finals, it is worth highlighting the wage discrimination for US and indeed global professional female players. This gender discrimination has resulted in the US women's national soccer team bringing a collective action lawsuit against the US Soccer Federation, which began in 2016, and in February of 2022, an equal pay agreement was settled by the Federation. So in this instance, the chorus did break the barrier. Similarly, Houston and Karame declare that one way that women are breaking silence is by reclaiming the form of women's discourse that men have labeled trivial, such as the unadulterated pleasure of pop music, the embracing of melodramatic team relationships, and girls playing soccer. As this paper argues, all of these have unruly subversive potential. As Halberstam notes, there is something all too powerful about a nearly hysterical audience of teen girls screaming and crying together. Thank you. And here are my references for the recording as well. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much for that. So we are now in the Q&A session. So we have just over 10 minutes. So we've got if our panelists could come back onto the screen would be really helpful. And if people can start putting their questions in the chat, so let me know or you could just put your hand up. That could be another way if you're trying to frantically write your question. So we'll start off. I've got here one from Andrea. If you wanted to ask it, or shall I read? I'll read it out. I've got a question for James. Are the all-female team and their transgressive behavior a way to challenge Foucault's idea of power?
That's a really great question. And actually some of the reading around sports and coaches of sport, who are often within Socrates male, have done Foucauldian readings of that kind of framework, that there's this kind of masculine controlling of the team and the team embodying that knowledge. And the fact that the coach dies, to a grisly end within the wilderness, I guess, yeah, it's a really good kind of example of that kind of subversion of a Foucauldian knowledge power structure within patriarchal society and within soccer and within football. So yes, I wholeheartedly agree on that.
Great.
Thank you.
Yep. We've got a question from Kate. She's happy for me to read it out. So Leanne, you focused on music, nostalgia, and meaning in relation to character in your paper, but I wanted to ask whether you think this might also apply intertextually to music, nostalgia, and meaning in relation to star actor. For instance, the use of PJ Harvey's Down by the Water in episode 1 reminded me immediately of Juliette Lewis's performance of PJ Harvey's Rid of Me in Strange Days. Yes, directed, of course, by Catherine Bigelow. It made me think about whether the use of the PJ Harvey song in Yellowjackets is working to make intertextual connections between female voices in traditionally male contexts, guitar, heavy rock, action, sci-fi, popular culture, and the narrative of Yellowjackets. And I wondered whether this might connect to James's arguments about Yellowjackets working to challenge spaces defined as masculine through its soundscape. So yeah, wondered, and she actually said she wondered what you both thought, but we'll start with Leanne.
So that's a great question, and I actually had some stuff about stardom in this paper that because wearing my other hat, I'm the co-convener for the Performance and Stardom SIG. So you read me very nicely there. So I think, yes, it can work in that way. And that PJ Harvey song is a really great example. And I think that's what I was kind of getting at, that there's layering and triple, kind of even quadruple sometimes encoding going on. And that fits with also what Natalie's costuming and hair looks like, because that's a clear kind of reference to Juliette Lewis in Natural Born Killers and what she looked like at that time. So there's all these sorts of references floating around there if you want to pick them up, or as I said, kind of listen to hear. And I think to link with James's paper as well, it's a really nice way to think about how these girls invade these traditionally masculine spaces and how that comes across through the music and through their characterization, but also, as you said, in your question, through their through the star presences of Juliette Lewis in particular. I don't know if I answered it, but the short answer is yes, I agree with you.
And Kate also said James as well, if you wanted to comment on that one.
Yeah, I think even the kind of, I think Juliette Lewis is a sort of marketing device, and sort of her star quality and her sort of crossing between music and film, I think was really important. And I think definitely that kind of taking control within male spaces. And also if we think about Nat's character as a kind of exemplar of that, but also how her space gets invaded by her father. So she brings in her friend, or sort of the person that she has a sort of romantic feelings for, who I completely forgot in the pilot is a completely different actor. So when they first came in, I hadn't realized it was the same character, but different person. But that space, it's sort of grunge posters and grunge and Riot Girl having those kind of pushback on certain gender norms. And then you have this dad who comes in and tries to sort of sexually shame her and all those kind of things. And the fact they have to keep quiet, the whole idea of silence, that she, in order to sort of be herself and share that moment, that they have to be quiet, and that doesn't happen. And of course, the trauma that she has to live with then of those kind of things. But yeah, I think, I don't know if that answered Kate's question either, but yeah, I completely agree as well, that there's a kind of avert through the sound, those sort of gendered, knowingly playing with those gendered soundscapes and representations.
All right, we've got a question from Vincent. So Vincent, if you wanted to ask your question.
Hi, can you see and hear me?
Yep.
Okay, right. So a question for Alexander and Amy. I was wondering, could the show's almost debunking of conspiracies be the logical extension of the nihilism that you pointed out for the younger versions of the characters? Now, because mystery box narrative encourages us to find meaning, and could Yellowjackets be effectively saying there is no meaning, and it's a wisdom the teenagers gained, but the adults have lost? And how much more bleak and terrifying is that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think, the way that kind of Yellowjackets, deals with almost, I suppose, debunking this kind of stuff, I think it shifts our attention away to other kinds of things, right? So like actually, you know, having to deal with those themes of like grief and trauma and loss and stuff. And yeah, when you, as you're saying, when there is no kind of meaning that can kind of be found or discovered through these kind of mysteries, it actually forces us as viewers, but also the characters as well, to like deal with those themes straight up, which can be quite terrifying, right? As one of the presentations at the start kind of noted, it deals with grief in a way that is really mundane and boring, right? It's just kind of there, intertwined into daily life, and confronting that, as you're saying, it's like terrifying, right? And I think that is one thing the show does, which I think is, you know, somewhat subversive in this space, is actually really forcing us through this kind of baiting to actually deal with those themes and grapple with those questions of, okay, what is the meaning here, right? Which I think, yeah, hopefully that addresses what you were talking about, but I think it's really quite interesting.
Thanks.
Amy,
if you've got anything to add.
No, I think Alex, I would definitely agree with Alex's answer there. I would only add, I think really, if there is sort of a grasping for meaning with the show in terms of looking elsewhere is really what I would push as well. Definitely look inside the house, you know, what's going on in that house in the wilderness is scarier than these sort of conjured ideas. And that's kind of what I would say is what the show is trying to focus on in that sort of sense.
Maybe a follow-up paper could be, what's in the house?
Yeah.